The social worker's face went pale when she saw my mother's name on the missing persons database because the woman had been living 3 miles from the orphanage for the last 15 years. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button right now. Tomorrow's story is going to completely blow your mind, and you won't want to miss it. I was 21 years old, standing in the parking lot of Meadowbrook Children's Home with a garbage bag full of clothes and nowhere to go. 18 years in the system, 18 years of being passed over during adoption events, of watching other kids get chosen while I sat in the corner pretending I didn't care. My case file had a note from when I was 3 that apparently made families uncomfortable. Mother, abandoned child at hospital. Father, unknown. Medical history incomplete. I guess people wanted kids with cleaner stories, ones without so many question marks. I remembered every single adoption event, the way prospective parents would walk through the common room, smiling at the younger kids, the cute ones who still believed families were magic. I learned to make myself invisible during those events, sitting with a book in the corner, building walls so thick that rejection couldn't touch me anymore. But it always did. Every time a family chose someone else, every time I heard another kid packing their bags with excitement, I felt that abandonment all over again. Why wasn't I enough? What was so wrong with me that even my own mother hadn't wanted to keep me? The discharge coordinator, Lisa, handed me a manila envelope with my documents. "There's a transitional housing program if you need it," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. 6 months maximum while you look for work. I nodded, shoving the envelope into my bag. I'd been preparing for this moment since I turned 16, saving every dollar from my part-time job at the mall, teaching myself to be invisible so the system would forget I existed. It almost worked. "Oh, one more thing," Lisa said, reaching into her desk. "This came for you last week. Some kind of tax document forwarded from the county." The envelope was addressed to me, but sent to a property address I didn't recognize. 14 Maple Ridge Road. I'd never heard of it, never been there, but apparently the county assessor thought I should know that property taxes were overdue. "Is this a mistake?" I asked. Lisa shrugged. "Probably. You know how bureaucracy is, but you might want to check it out. Could be identity theft or something." I almost threw the envelope away. What did I care about some random address? But that night, in the dingy transitional housing room that smelled like mildew and old cigarettes, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that envelope, about the specific way my name was typed on the label. Not a computer-generated label, but someone using an old typewriter, like someone had been keeping track of me. The next morning, I went to the public library and looked up the port address. 14 Maple Ridge Road was a property about 30 miles outside the city, in a rural area I'd never visited. The satellite view showed a small farmhouse surrounded by overgrown fields and trees. According to public records, the property had been abandoned for over a decade, with taxes unpaid since 2009. But here was the strange part. The last registered owner was listed as Sarah M. Whoever had lived there simply stopped paying taxes 15 years ago and disappeared from all records. I stared at that name for a long time. Sarah, my mother's name was Sarah. But that didn't mean anything. Sarah was a common name. Thousands of women were named Sarah. This was probably just a coincidence, some clerical error that had nothing to do with me. Except I couldn't stop thinking about it. I used some of my precious savings to take a bus to the town nearest to Maple Ridge Road. It was one of those dying rural communities with more empty storefronts than open ones, the kind of place young people left and never came back to. I walked into the only diner that looked operational and ordered coffee I couldn't afford. The waitress, probably in her 60s with gray hair and tired eyes, set down the cup and studied me. "You're not from around here." "No, ma'am," I said. "I'm looking for an address, 14 Maple Ridge Road. Do you know it?" Her expression shifted, something between surprise and suspicion. "The old Turner place? Nobody's lived there in years. Why are you asking?" "I got a tax notice," I said, which was technically true. "I'm trying to figure out if it's a mistake." She sat down across from me without asking, lowering her voice. "What's your name?" "Riley," I said. "Riley Ann." Her eyes widened. "Ann? Your middle name is Ann?" I nodded slowly, confused by her reaction. "Stay here," she said, standing abruptly. She disappeared into the back and returned 5 minutes later with an old photograph, the kind that had faded to sepia tones. It showed a young woman, maybe 25, standing in front of the farmhouse I'd seen on the satellite map. She was holding a baby. "This was taken about 22 years ago," the waitress said. "The woman's name was Sarah Ann. She showed up in town one day, bought that property cash, and kept to herself mostly. Never talked about where she came from or if she had family. Then one day, about 15 years ago, she just vanished, left everything behind. Some folks thought maybe something bad happened to her, but the police never found anything suspicious. The property's been sitting empty ever since." I couldn't breathe. The woman in the photo had dark hair like mine, the same sharp chin and wide-set eyes I saw in the mirror every day. And she was holding a baby who looked about 6 months old. I would have been 6 months old 22 years ago. "The baby," I whispered. "What happened to the baby?" The waitress shook her head. "Nobody knew she had a baby. She was real private. When she disappeared, there was no sign of a child in the house. Police figured if there had been one, she must have taken it with her. But she hadn't taken me with her. She'd left me at a hospital 70 miles away, with no identification, no explanation. The timeline matched perfectly. My mother had abandoned me, then come back here and lived alone for years before disappearing again." "Can you tell me how to get to the farmhouse?" I asked. The waitress hesitated. "It's not safe out there. Structure's probably falling apart by now, and there's no electricity." "I need to see it." She must have recognized something in my face, some desperate need that reminded her of the woman in the photograph, because she drew me a map on a napkin and handed it over. "Be careful," she said, "and if you find anything important, maybe let someone know. Sarah was a good person, whatever else happened. She deserves to have her story told right." The road to Maple Ridge was barely more than a dirt path through dense woods. I walked for almost an hour before the trees opened up to reveal the farmhouse. It looked worse than the satellite image, with windows broken and the porch sagging dangerously. But it was still standing, stubborn and forgotten in the middle of nowhere. The front door was unlocked, hanging slightly crooked on its hinges. Inside, everything was covered in dust and debris, but I could see signs of the life my mother had lived here. A kitchen table with 2 chairs, a bookshelf filled with water-damaged novels, a rocking chair facing a window that looked out over the fields. I moved through the house slowly, touching surfaces and trying to imagine her here. What had she been thinking? Why had she abandoned me only to build this isolated life alone? What had she been running from or hiding from? In the kitchen, I found a calendar still hanging on the wall, frozen on March 2009. The squares were filled with notes in my mother's handwriting: therapy appointment, pick up prescription, call about Riley. That last note repeated on multiple dates, sometimes with question marks, sometimes underlined multiple times. She'd been thinking about me, trying to figure out how to reach me. I opened the refrigerator, now just an empty box with the door hanging open, and found a collection of magnets holding faded photographs. Most were of me at different ages, obviously taken from a distance. Me at 7 years old, walking into the children's home. Me at 10, sitting on a bench reading a book. Me at 13, waiting at a bus stop. My mother had been watching me, documenting my life from the shadows, unable to be part of it, but unwilling to let me go completely. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms. The larger one had a bed frame with no mattress and a dresser with all the drawers pulled out, probably by someone looking for valuables years ago. But the smaller bedroom made me stop in the doorway. It was a nursery. The walls were painted a soft yellow, and though the paint was peeling now, I could see where someone had carefully stenciled white clouds across one wall. There was a crib, handmade from what looked like oak, with intricate carvings along the headboard. A mobile hung above it, little wooden animals that moved slightly in the breeze from the broken window. And on the dresser was a framed photograph. It was me, a professional baby photo taken when I was probably 3 months old, the kind hospitals offer to new mothers. I was wearing a white dress and looking at the camera with solemn eyes. On the back, someone had written in careful script, "Riley Ann. 3 months. I'm so sorry." My hand shook as I set the photo down. She'd kept a picture of me. She'd built me a nursery and bought me a crib and painted clouds on the walls. This wasn't the room of someone who didn't care. This was the room of someone who'd been preparing for something, planning for something that never happened. What comes next is something I never saw coming. Stick with me and make sure you subscribe. I searched the rest of the nursery frantically, pulling open drawers and looking under furniture. In the closet, I found a metal lockbox hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. It was rusted but still locked. I grabbed a screwdriver from a toolbox I'd seen downstairs and pried it open. Inside were documents, medical records, legal papers, and a journal with a worn leather cover. The medical records were mine from the hospital where I'd been left. But there were other records too, ones I'd never seen. Psychiatric evaluations, medication prescriptions, admission papers to a facility called Riverside Behavioral Health Center. My mother hadn't abandoned me because she didn't want me. She'd abandoned me because she was sick. I opened the journal with trembling hands and started reading. The entries began when I was born, full of love and hope and terror, all mixed together. My mother wrote about holding me for the first time, about being overwhelmed by how much she loved me and how scared she was that she wouldn't be enough. She wrote about hearing voices that told her terrible things, about paranoia that made her believe people were following her, trying to take me away. The entries became more erratic as the weeks passed. She wrote about not sleeping for days, about believing the government was monitoring her through the television, about episodes where she couldn't remember hours of time. She knew something was wrong. She knew she needed help, but was terrified that if she admitted she was mentally ill, they'd take me away permanently. So she'd made a different choice. She'd brought me to the hospital, given me to people who could keep me safe, and then disappeared. She'd come here to this farmhouse, trying to get better, trying to become someone who could take care of a child. But the voices never stopped. The journal entries showed her trying different medications, going to therapy sessions in the city, fighting to get better so she could come back for me. Year after year of trying and failing and trying again. The last entry was dated 15 years ago, written in handwriting that was barely legible. I saw Riley today, followed the social worker taking her to school. She's 6 years old now, and so beautiful. She doesn't know me. I stood across the street and watched her play with other children during recess. She laughed at something another girl said, and I heard her voice for the first time in years. I wanted to run to her, to tell her I'm her mother, and I never stopped loving her. But I can't. I'm getting worse again. The medications aren't working anymore. Yesterday, I lost 4 hours and don't remember where I went or what I did. The voices are telling me to hurt people, hurt myself. I'm scared of what I might do. I can't go back to Riley. I can't risk hurting her or terrifying her with my illness. So I'm leaving. There's a facility up north that specializes in cases like mine. I'm going to check myself in and stay until I'm better. Really better. Not just managing, but actually well. And then, maybe someday, I can explain everything to her. I can tell her why I left and how much I loved her even when I was gone. The house is paid off. I'm leaving all my documents here in case she ever needs them. If something happens to me, if I don't make it back, at least she'll know the truth. She'll know it wasn't her fault. She'll know I loved her more than anything in this world. I'm sorry, Riley. I'm so sorry for everything. That was the last entry. I flipped through the remaining pages, but they were all blank. My mother had left for that facility and never come back. I sat on the dusty floor of the nursery, surrounded by the pieces of a story I'd never known, and cried. All those years of thinking I'd been unwanted, of believing I wasn't good enough to keep. And the truth was, my mother had loved me so much that she'd given me up rather than risk hurting me. She'd sacrificed her own happiness, her own connection to me, because she'd thought it was what I needed. I gathered up all the documents and the journal and took them back to town. The waitress at the diner, whose name I learned was Margaret, helped me file a missing persons report. We gave them my mother's full name from the documents, Sarah Ann Mitchell, and her photograph. The police were sympathetic, but not hopeful. 15 years is a long time, the officer said. If she checked into a facility, there should be records. We'll look into it, but you should prepare yourself for the possibility that we might not find good news. I moved into the farmhouse while they investigated. It felt wrong somehow, living in the space my mother had built, but I also felt closer to her there than I'd ever felt to anyone. I cleaned and repaired what I could, sleeping in the rocking chair because the bedrooms felt too personal to claim as my own. Margaret visited regularly, bringing food and company. She told me more. Stories about Sarah, how she'd volunteer at the community center, how she'd helped Margaret's grandson with his homework when he was struggling in school. My mother had been part of this community, had been loved here, even if she'd been fighting invisible demons the whole time. Over those weeks of waiting, I began to understand my mother in ways I never could have before. I read her journal cover to cover multiple times, studying her handwriting, learning the patterns of her illness. Some entries were clear and lucid, full of plans and hope. Others were fragmented, paranoid, showing the grip of psychosis. But through it all, my name appeared on nearly every page. Riley, my daughter, my baby girl. I found letters she'd written but never sent, addressed to me at different ages. One for when I turned 10, explaining why she couldn't be there. One for my 16th birthday, filled with advice about growing up. One for my 18th, telling me everything she'd wanted to say if she'd ever gotten the chance. Reading them felt like having conversations with a ghost, hearing her voice across the years of silence. 3 weeks after I filed the report, the police called. They'd found records of Sarah checking into Riverside Behavioral Health Center in 2009. But the facility had closed in 2014, and patient records were incomplete. What they did have showed that Sarah had been transferred to a different facility in 2011, one that specialized in long-term care for treatment-resistant cases. "We're still tracking down the current location," the officer said, "but, Ms. Ann, I need to prepare you. The transfer was marked as permanent placement. If your mother is still alive, she's been institutionalized for over 13 years. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in my mother's rocking chair and looked out over the fields she used to see every day. She was alive, somewhere in the system, in a hospital or facility. My mother was alive. It took another month to find her. The bureaucracy of mental health care was a maze of privacy laws and administrative hurdles, but eventually, with the help of a patient advocate Margaret connected me with, we tracked Sarah Ann Mitchell to a residential care facility 4 hours north. I made the drive on a cold morning in November, my heart pounding the entire way. The facility was nice, nicer than I'd expected. A sprawling campus with gardens and walking paths, more like a small college than a hospital. The director, Dr. Chen, met me in her office and explained that my mother was in their long-term care wing for patients with severe and persistent mental illness. "Sarah has paranoid schizophrenia," Dr. Chen said gently. "She's been with us for 8 years now. The medications help, but she still experiences episodes. She's stable enough for supervised visits, but I need to be honest with you. She may not recognize you. She may not be able to engage in a meaningful way. Are you prepared for that?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Dr. Chen led me through the facility to a common room where several residents were watching television or working on puzzles. She gestured to a woman sitting by a window, looking out at the gardens. My mother was 43 years old, but looked older, her dark hair now streaked with gray, her face lined with years of medication and illness. But I recognized her immediately. She had my eyes, my chin, my hands. "Sarah," Dr. Chen said softly, "you have a visitor." My mother turned, and for a moment there was no recognition in her face. Then her eyes widened, and her hand went to her mouth. "Riley?" she whispered. "Riley Ann?" I couldn't speak. I just nodded. She stood slowly, like she was afraid sudden movement would make me disappear. "You found me. I thought I'd never see you again." "I found the house," I said, my voice cracking. "I found your journal. I know everything, Mom." She started crying then, and so did I. Dr. Chen quietly left the room as I crossed the distance between us and hugged my mother for the first time in 21 years. She felt fragile in my arms, but she held on to me like I was the only real thing in her world. We talked for hours that day and many days after. My mother's illness meant the conversations weren't always linear. Sometimes she'd forget what we'd been discussing or become anxious about things I couldn't see. But she was still my mother, and she'd never stopped loving me. She told me about the years of trying to get better, of hoping that someday she'd be well enough to find me. She asked about my life, and I told her about the system, about aging out, about finding the farmhouse. She cried when she learned I'd been so close to her all those years, living in the same city where she'd once watched me play at recess. "I wanted to be a good mother," she said during one visit. "I wanted to give you everything, but I couldn't even give you myself." "You gave me everything that mattered," I told her. "You gave me life, and you gave me up to keep me safe. That's love, Mom. That's what real love looks like." The visits became a routine. Every Saturday, I'd drive the 4 hours north, bringing photos and stories from the farmhouse. I showed her pictures of the repairs I was making, the garden I'd started, the way the community had embraced me. Her face would light up when I talked about Margaret and the other neighbors who remembered her fondly. Dr. Chen told me the visits were transformative for my mother. "She has something to anchor herself to now," the doctor explained. "For years, she's lived in her head, disconnected from the present. But you've given her a reason to stay grounded, to fight through the fog of her illness. We've been able to reduce some of her medications because she's more stable than she's been in years." I started visiting every week, bringing photos of the farmhouse as I restored it, telling her about Margaret and the community that had known her. Slowly, carefully, I brought pieces of her old life back to her. The doctors said she was improving, engaging more, having fewer episodes. "Having you in her life is better than any medication," Dr. Chen told me. "She has something to anchor herself to now, a reason to fight for clarity." I moved into the farmhouse permanently and got a job at the local library. Margaret helped me navigate the process of claiming the property officially, dealing with the back taxes and legal paperwork. The community rallied around me in ways I'd never experienced in my life. People brought furniture, helped with repairs, welcomed me like I'd always belonged there. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be chosen, not by one family, but by an entire community that saw me as one of their own. On my mother's 44th birthday, I brought her to the farmhouse for a supervised day visit. She walked through the room slowly, touching surfaces and remembering. When we got to the nursery, she stood in the doorway for a long time. "I painted those clouds," she said. "I wanted you to have something beautiful to look at. I wanted you to dream." "I did dream," I told her. "I dreamed of finding you, and I did." She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry I couldn't be the mother you deserved." "You were exactly the mother I needed," I said. "You taught me that love isn't always simple or easy. Sometimes it means letting go. And you taught me that it's never too late to find your way home." We stood together in that yellow room with its painted clouds, and for the first time in both our lives, we were exactly where we belonged. My mother reached out and touched one of the clouds she'd painted over 20 years ago, her fingers trembling. "I used to stand here and imagine you sleeping in that crib," she said softly. "I'd picture reading you stories and singing you to sleep. I had so many plans for us. And then the voices got louder, and I knew I couldn't trust myself any more. Leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did, but staying would have been worse." I took her hand and held it tight. "You made the right choice, Mom. You kept me safe, even when it cost you everything." We spent the afternoon in the house, and I showed her everything I'd done to restore it. The kitchen where I'd repainted the cabinets, the living room where I'd refinished the hardwood floors, the garden where I'd planted vegetables and flowers. She smiled at each new detail, pride mixing with sadness in her expression. "You've made it beautiful," she said. "You've made it a home again." Before we left, she asked to see her journal one more time. I brought it to her, and she flipped through the pages, reading entries she'd written in her darkest moments. When she finished, she closed the book and handed it back to me. "Keep this," she said, "not to remember the pain, but to remember that even in the worst times, love survives. I never stopped loving you. Riley, not for a single day." Thank you so much for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss tomorrow's incredible story. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered something about your family that changed everything? Have you struggled with mental illness in your family or learned to see someone in a completely new way? Share your story with us and check out the 2 videos on your screen right now for more powerful stories about family, love, and never giving up hope. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember that every person has a story worth knowing.